In the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, a museum's dusty archive hides a deadly secret. When curator Ernest Pritchard is found strangled with a silk scarf, the gleaming Anglo-Saxon brooch at the heart of his work becomes the key to a chilling mystery. Was it the gruff guard hiding resentment behind polished boots? The proud historian guarding her reputation with trembling hands? The wealthy donor whose legacy hangs by a thread? Or the curious visitor whose ink-stained fingers hint at deeper secrets? Join Miss Jane Marple as she unravels a web of pride, deceit, and a forged artifact, where one false move led to murder, and the truth lies in the smallest clues. Chapter 1. The Silent Archive. The morning air in St. Mary Mead carried the crisp bite of autumn, with leaves swirling gently down the cobbled lanes. Miss Jane Marple, wrapped in a tweed coat and her favorite woolen scarf, walked with a measured step toward the St. Mary's Museum, a modest stone building that housed the village's modest but cherished collection of relics. Her old friend, Mrs. Clara Bantry, had insisted she come for a private viewing of a newly acquired treasure, an Anglo-Saxon brooch said to be a gift from a wealthy benefactor. "It's quite the coup for our little museum, Jane," Mrs. Bantry had said over tea the previous day, her eyes bright with excitement. "You simply must see it." The museum stood at the edge of the village green, its ivy-clad facade giving it an air of quiet dignity. Inside, the air was cool and musty, scented with old paper and polished wood. Miss Marple, her sharp eyes taking in every detail, followed Mrs. Bantry through the main gallery, where glass cases displayed chipped pottery and faded manuscripts. A young woman, Miss Susan Drake, lingered near a display of Roman coins, her notebook open as she scribbled eagerly. Miss Marple noted her enthusiasm with a faint smile. Such passion for history often hid a deeper story. They descended a narrow staircase to the archive room, a dimly lit chamber where the museum kept its most delicate treasures. The door was ajar, and Mrs. Bantry pushed it open with a cheerful remark about the curator's punctuality. But her words died as she froze in the doorway. Miss Marple, peering over her friend's shoulder, saw the reason for her silence. Mr. Ernest Pritchard, the curator, sat slumped over a heavy oak table, his head resting unnaturally on a pile of papers. A silk scarf, embroidered with peacock feathers, was knotted tightly around his neck, its vibrant colors a jarring contrast to his pallid face. His eyes, wide and unseeing, stared into nothingness, and his fingers clutched a magnifying glass, as if frozen in the act of scrutiny. Mrs. Bantry let out a stifled gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. "Oh, Jane, he's dead," she whispered. Miss Marple, her expression calm but her mind already racing, stepped forward. She noted the scattered papers on the floor, the open wooden box containing the Anglo-Saxon brooch, its gold filigree catching the faint light from a high window. The room was otherwise undisturbed, its shelves lined with leather-bound volumes and labeled crates. A single chair was overturned, suggesting a brief struggle, but there was no blood, no chaos, only the eerie stillness of death. "Clara, dear, you must fetch the police at once," Miss Marple said quietly, her voice steady. Mrs. Bantry nodded, her face pale, and hurried upstairs. Alone in the archive, Miss Marple resisted the urge to touch anything, though her fingers twitched at the thought of straightening the papers. Instead, she observed. The scarf was an elegant thing, not the sort one might expect in a dusty archive. Its presence felt deliberate, almost theatrical. The brooch, too, seemed to command attention, its intricate design drawing her eye. She wondered if it held a clue to the violence that had unfolded here. Footsteps echoed above, and soon Inspector Craddock appeared, his familiar face set in a grim line. He greeted Miss Marple with a respectful nod, accustomed to her presence at such scenes, though he never quite understood how she came to be involved. "A nasty business, Miss Marple," he said, surveying the room. "Strangulation, by the look of it. Not a common method, but effective." He knelt beside the body, careful not to disturb the scarf, while his constable began taking notes. Miss Marple stood back, her knitting bag clutched in her hands, the faint click of her needles a soothing rhythm. She watched as Craddock's men searched the room, their voices low. A young constable pointed out the brooch, and Craddock frowned. "That's the new acquisition, isn't it? Worth a pretty penny, I'd wager." Miss Marple said nothing, but her mind turned to the people who had been in the museum that morning. There was Harold Gibbs, the night guard, whom she had seen polishing his boots in the foyer earlier, his manner gruff but dutiful. Dr. Evelyn Ward, the historian, had been mentioned by Mrs. Bantry as a frequent presence, her expertise vital to the museum's work. Mr. Lionel Crest, the donor, had been expected to attend the viewing, his pride in the brooch well known. And then there was Miss Drake, the eager visitor whose curiosity had brought her close to the archive. "People are so careless with their secrets," Miss Marple murmured to herself, her eyes narrowing as she studied the scarf's intricate embroidery. She thought of a neighbor in St. Mary Mead, Mrs. Price, who had once used a similar scarf to hide a stain on her dress, a small deception, but revealing. "It's the small things," she thought, "that tell the largest truths." As Inspector Craddock began to organize his inquiries, Miss Marple stepped back, her presence unobtrusive, yet keenly felt. She knew the truth lay not in the grand gestures, but in the quiet details. The dust on a boot, the tremor in a voice, the choice of a scarf. The archive, silent now, held its secrets tightly, but Miss Marple was patient. She would unravel them, one thread at a time. Chapter 2. The Four Suspects. The St. Mary's Museum, though modest in size, seemed to loom larger under the weight of tragedy. The archive room, where Mr. Ernest Pritchard's body had been discovered, was now cordoned off by Inspector Craddock's men, their low voices mingling with the creak of floorboards and the distant hum of village life outside. Miss Jane Marple sat in the museum's small reading room, a cozy space with faded armchairs and shelves of local history books, her knitting needles moving rhythmically as she listened to the murmur of activity. Mrs. Clara Bantry, still shaken but resolute, had insisted on staying to assist the police, her sense of duty as a trustee overriding her distress. "It's dreadful, Jane," she whispered, her hands twisting a lace handkerchief. "Who could do such a thing in our quiet little museum?" Miss Marple's eyes, bright and bird-like, flickered toward her friend. "People, Clara," she said softly, "are capable of surprising things, especially when they believe no one is watching." Her tone was gentle, but there was a steel beneath it, honed by years of observing human nature in St. Mary Mead. She had already begun to catalogue the morning's events in her mind, each detail a piece of a puzzle she was determined to solve. The silk scarf, the untouched brooch, the scattered papers, all pointed to a purpose behind the violence, though its shape remained elusive. Inspector Craddock, efficient and methodical, had gathered the 4 individuals present in the museum at the time of the murder. He had set up a temporary interview space in the museum's lecture hall, a room with high ceilings and rows of wooden chairs facing a small podium. The suspects, as Miss Marple noted with interest, were a varied group, each carrying an air of unease that betrayed more than their words might. Craddock, aware of Miss Marple's uncanny knack for seeing what others missed, had invited her to sit in on the interviews, though he framed it as a courtesy to Mrs. Bantry's friend. Miss Marple accepted with a demure nod, settling into a chair at the back, her knitting a quiet companion. The first to be questioned was Mr. Harold Gibbs, the night guard. A burly man in his late 40s, Gibbs had the weathered look of someone accustomed to long hours and little sleep. His uniform was immaculate, the brass buttons gleaming, though Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught a faint smudge of dust on the heel of one polished boot, a detail that seemed out of place for a man so particular about his appearance. Gibbs stood stiffly before Craddock, his hands clasped behind his back like a soldier at attention. "I was on my rounds, sir," Gibbs said, his voice gruff but steady. "Up in the upper galleries, checking the locks and windows. It's my routine every morning before the museum opens. Didn't see? Nothing out of the ordinary till I heard Miss Drake scream." He shifted his weight, his eyes darting briefly to the floor. "I ran down to the archive and found Mr. Pritchard like that." Craddock leaned forward, his pen poised over his notebook. "And what time was this, Mr. Gibbs?" "About 9:30, sir. I'd just finished my rounds when I heard her. Took me a minute to get downstairs. Those old stairs ain't kind to my knees." Gibbs rubbed his leg as if to emphasize the point, but Miss Marple noted the gesture seemed practiced, almost theatrical. "Did you see anyone else near the archive?" Craddock pressed. Gibbs shook his head. "No, sir. Just Miss Drake, standing there all pale and shaking. I told her to stay put and went to fetch Mrs. Bantry." He hesitated, then added, "Mr. Pritchard and we didn't always see eye to eye. He was always on about my hours, saying I wasn't thorough enough, but I'd never do him harm. I need this job." Miss Marple's needles paused for a fraction of a second. She had known men like Gibbs in St. Mary Mead, gruff, dependable types who took pride in their work but bristled at criticism. Yet the dust on his boot nagged at her. The archive room's floor was thick with it, undisturbed except where the body lay. A guard on his rounds would not have ventured there, unless— She filed the thought away, her expression serene. Next came Dr. Evelyn Ward, the historian. A woman in her early 50s, Dr. Ward carried herself with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being heard. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her tweed suit, though practical, was cut with a certain elegance. She sat opposite Craddock, her hands folded in her lap, but Miss Marple noticed a faint tremor as she adjusted her wire-rimmed glasses. A nervous habit, perhaps. "I was in my office upstairs, working on a paper about Anglo-Saxon metalwork," Dr. Ward said, her voice crisp but tinged with strain. "Mr. Pritchard and I had been collaborating on the cataloging of the new brooch. I didn't see him this morning until I was called to the archive after the discovery." Her lips tightened, and she glanced away, as if the memory were too much. Craddock raised an eyebrow. "You worked closely with Mr. Pritchard. Any disagreements?" Dr. Ward's eyes flashed briefly. "He could be difficult, overly particular, dismissive of my suggestions. He thought his knowledge of artifacts surpassed everyone else's, which was frankly absurd. But we managed. She adjusted her glasses again, her fingers lingering on the frames. I had no reason to wish him ill. Miss Marple watched her closely. Dr. Ward's composure was admirable, but there was a brittleness to it, like porcelain that might crack under pressure. In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had known a schoolteacher, Miss Ellis, whose impeccable manners hid a fierce ambition. When her reputation was threatened by a rival's discovery of a forged certificate, Miss Ellis had gone to great lengths to protect her secret. Dr. Ward, with her scholarly pride, reminded Miss Marple of that same intensity. The brooch, she suspected, was more than a mere artifact to the historian. The third suspect, Mr. Lionel Crest, entered the lecture hall with the confidence of a man accustomed to command. In his early 60s, Crest was impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, his silver hair swept back, and a gold watch chain glinting at his waist. His donation of the Anglo-Saxon brooch had been the talk of the village, a gesture that had cemented his status as a local benefactor. He sat with an air of ease, but Miss Marple noted the way his fingers drummed lightly on the armrest, a sign of impatience or perhaps unease. "I came to the museum this morning to discuss the brooch's display," Crest said, his voice smooth and cultured. "It was a family heirloom, you know, passed down from my late wife's side. I wanted to ensure it was presented properly. I spoke with Pritchard briefly in the archive, then left him to his work. He was alive when I departed." He spread his hands as if the matter were simple. "I was in the main gallery, admiring the Roman exhibit, when I heard the commotion." Craddock scribbled a note. "And you saw no one else near the archive?" "No one," Crest replied firmly. "Though I did pass Miss Drake in the gallery. She seemed engrossed in her notebook." He smiled faintly, as if recalling a charming detail, but Miss Marple caught a flicker of calculation in his eyes. A monogrammed handkerchief, she recalled, had been found near the archive door, bearing the initials L.C. When Craddock mentioned it, Crest's smile faltered. "Careless of me," he said quickly. "I must have dropped it during my visit. I'm forever misplacing things." His laugh was light, but it did not reach his eyes. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. In her village, she had known a squire, Mr. Harrow, whose charm masked a ruthless streak. He, too, had been careless with a monogrammed item, a cigar case left at the scene of a petty theft. Carelessness, she thought, was often a convenient excuse. Crest's pride in the brooch was evident, but was it pride in its history or in its value? Finally, Miss Susan Drake was called. A young woman in her late 20s, she had the earnest air of a student, her brown hair tied back with a simple ribbon, and her hands stained with ink from her note-taking. She sat nervously, her eyes darting between Craddock and the floor, as if unsure of her place in such grave proceedings. "I was just visiting the museum," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I love history, you see, and I've been coming here often to study the exhibits. Dr. Ward's lectures are wonderful. She knows so much about Anglo-Saxon culture. I wanted to see the new brooch, so I wandered toward the archive. The door was open, and I saw Mr. Pritchard." Her voice broke, and she pressed a hand to her mouth. I screamed, and Mr. Gibbs came running. Craddock's tone was gentle but firm. "Did you touch anything in the archive, Miss Drake?" No, I didn't," she said quickly. "I was too shocked. I just stood there until Mr. Gibbs arrived." Her fingers twisted together, and Miss Marple noted the ink stains again, fresh, as if she had been writing or handling manuscripts that very morning. A curious detail for a visitor who claimed to have been merely browsing. Miss Marple leaned back, her mind sifting through the testimonies. Each suspect had a story, plausible on its surface, but human nature, she knew, was rarely so tidy. Gibbs's dust-smudged boot suggested he had been somewhere he shouldn't. Dr. Ward's nervous tic betrayed a deeper anxiety, perhaps tied to her work with the brooch. Crest's handkerchief, so conveniently misplaced, hinted at a staged carelessness, and Miss Drake's ink-stained hands spoke of more than casual curiosity. In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had seen such small inconsistencies unravel grand deceptions. A maid's misplaced hairpin, a vicar's forgotten letter. Here, in the quiet museum, the truth lay hidden in similar trifles. As Craddock dismissed Miss Drake and prepared to review his notes, Miss Marple spoke up, her voice soft but clear. "Inspector, might I suggest a closer look at the scarf? It's such an unusual choice for a murder weapon, don't you think? Not the sort of thing one carries by chance." Craddock nodded, accustomed to her gentle prodding, and promised to have it examined. Mrs. Bantry, hovering nearby, looked at her friend with a mixture of awe and exasperation. "Jane, you're doing it again, seeing things no one else does. How do you manage it?" Miss Marple smiled, her needles resuming their rhythm. "It's only a matter of paying attention, Clara. People are like skeins of wool, tangled perhaps, but with a pattern if you look closely enough." She thought of the scarf, its peacock feathers vivid in her mind. It was a woman's scarf, she was certain, and its presence in the archive was no accident. Whose neck had it adorned before it became a noose? And why had the brooch, so central to the morning's events, been left untouched? As the suspects dispersed, their footsteps echoing in the empty hall, Miss Marple felt the familiar stir of intuition. The museum, with its relics of the past, was a fitting stage for a modern tragedy. The truth, she knew, would emerge not from grand revelations, but from the quiet threads of human frailty. Jealousy, pride, fear. She would watch and listen and knit until the pattern revealed itself. Chapter 3. The Scene of the Crime. The St. Mary's Museum, with its hushed galleries and shadowed corners, seemed to hold its breath as the investigation deepened. The archive room, where Mr. Ernest Pritchard had met his end, was now a focal point of quiet activity, with Inspector Craddock's men moving carefully to preserve every detail. Miss Jane Marple, permitted to observe under the guise of assisting Mrs. Bantry, stood just outside the cordoned-off doorway, her small figure unobtrusive yet keenly alert. Her knitting bag hung from her arm, the faint clink of needles a familiar counterpoint to her racing thoughts. The room before her was a tableau of tragedy, and she studied it with the precision of one accustomed to finding truth in the mundane. The archive was a cramped, low-ceilinged space, its walls lined with sagging shelves that groaned under the weight of leather-bound ledgers, cracked pottery, and carefully labeled boxes. A single high window admitted a sliver of gray autumn light, casting long shadows across the stone floor, which was coated in a fine layer of dust, disturbed only in the area near the body. At the center of the room stood a heavy oak table, its surface cluttered with papers, a brass inkstand, and the open wooden box containing the Anglo-Saxon brooch. The brooch itself gleamed with an almost defiant brilliance, its intricate gold filigree untouched by the violence that had unfolded nearby. Mr. Pritchard's body had been removed, But Miss Marple could still picture him slumped there, the silk scarf with its peacock feathers knotted cruelly around his neck. Inspector Craddock, his face set in a frown of concentration, directed a young constable to photograph the scene. "Careful now, Jenkins," he said, his voice low. "Every inch of this room matters." He turned to Miss Marple, his expression softening slightly. "You've a sharp eye, Miss Marple. Anything strike you as peculiar?" Miss Marple tilted her head, her gaze lingering on the scarf, which now lay in a sealed bag on a side table, awaiting further examination. "It's a very particular choice, Inspector," she said softly. "A silk scarf, so delicate, yet strong enough to do what it did. It wasn't taken from this room, I think. It belongs to someone." Her voice was gentle, almost musing, but Craddock knew better than to dismiss her observations. The constable, Jenkins, pointed to the scattered papers on the floor. "Looks like he was working on something, sir. These were under the table, like they'd been knocked off in a struggle." He held up a few sheets, their edges yellowed, covered in Pritchard's meticulous handwriting. Miss Marple stepped closer, her eyes scanning the pages without touching them. They appeared to be notes on the brooch, detailing its supposed provenance, a gift from a noble family, dating to the 8th century. Yet one sheet caught her attention, a half-finished sketch of the brooch, with a question mark scrawled beside a note about its metal composition. "Curious," Miss Marple murmured, her needles pausing. "Mr. Pritchard was a careful man, wasn't he? To question his own work suggests doubt." She thought of old Mr. Grayson in St. Mary Mead, a retired jeweler who had once spotted a flaw in a supposedly antique ring, his suspicion leading to the exposure of a local swindler. Doubt, she knew, could be a dangerous thing in the wrong hands. Craddock nodded, following her gaze. "You think he suspected something about the brooch?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple replied, her tone non-committal. "But it's the scarf that interests me most. It's not the sort of thing one leaves lying about, nor does it seem the kind of weapon one chooses on impulse." She glanced at the hook on the wall where the scarf had been found, looped as if casually discarded. The hook was low, easily reached, and free of dust, a detail that suggested it was frequently used. "Someone brought it here, Inspector, and meant for it to be seen." The room held other clues, though they were less obvious. A single chair, its back carved with faded vines, lay overturned near the table, its legs pointing skyward like a fallen soldier. The dust on the floor showed scuff marks, but they were confined to a small area, suggesting a brief, contained struggle. Miss Marple's eyes traced the marks, noting their direction toward the table, as if Pritchard had been caught off guard from behind. The magnifying glass, still resting where it had fallen from his hand, was a fine instrument, its lens unclouded. "He was examining something closely," she said, almost to herself. "Perhaps the brooch, or perhaps these papers." Mrs. Bantry, who had been hovering near the doorway wringing her hands, spoke up. "Jane, it's all so dreadful. Why would anyone do this in our museum? It's just a little place, not some grand London institution." Her voice trembled, but there was a spark of indignation, as if the crime were a personal affront to Saint Mary Mead's dignity. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Even little places, Clara, have their secrets. A museum is a keeper of the past, and the past can stir passions, greed, pride, fear." She thought of a village scandal years ago, when a forged will had surfaced in St. Mary Mead's church records, leading to bitter disputes among heirs. The archive, with its trove of history, was no different, a place where the past could become a weapon. Craddock's men continued their work, dusting for fingerprints and cataloging items. The wooden box containing the brooch drew Miss Marple's attention again. It was finely crafted, lined with velvet, and bore no signs of tampering. Why, she wondered, had the killer left it untouched? If robbery were the motive, the brooch would surely have been taken. Yet there it sat, a silent witness to the crime. She recalled a conversation with her nephew, Raymond, who dealt in antiques and had once described the fervor surrounding rare artifacts. "People will do anything for a piece of history," he had said, "especially if it's worth a fortune or a reputation." The constable, Jenkins, interrupted her thoughts. "Sir, we've found something else. A key under the table, half hidden by the papers." He held up a small brass key, its surface tarnished but intact. Craddock took it, turning it over in his gloved hand. "Looks like it fits a lockbox or a cabinet. Any ideas, Miss Marple?" She peered at the key, her mind racing. "It's small, isn't it? Not for a door, I think, but perhaps for something private, a drawer or a case for valuable documents." She glanced at the shelves where several locked cabinets stood among the books. Mr. Pritchard was a man of order. If he kept something locked away, it was important. Craddock ordered the cabinets checked, but none matched the key. Miss Marple filed the detail away, her thoughts returning to the suspects. Harold Gibbs, the guard, had claimed to be upstairs, yet the dust on his boot suggested otherwise. Dr. Evelyn Ward, with her nervous adjustment of her glasses, had been evasive about the brooch's provenance. Mr. Lionel Crest's handkerchief, found so conveniently near the archive, hinted at a staged carelessness, and Miss Susan Drake's ink-stained hands spoke of more than casual browsing. Each, in their way, was tethered to this room, to the brooch, to the scarf. As the police continued their search, Miss Marple stepped back, her eyes sweeping the room one last time. The archive was a place of preservation, yet it had become a stage for destruction. She thought of the scarf again, its peacock feathers a vivid splash of color in the drab room. In St. Mary Mead, she had known a young woman, Miss Carter, who wore such scarves to draw attention, to distract from her true intentions. The scarf here, she suspected, was no mere accident. It was a statement, or perhaps a misdirection. "Jane, you're awfully quiet," Mrs. Bantry said, her voice pulling Miss Marple from her reverie. "What are you thinking?" Miss Marple's smile was gentle but enigmatic. "I'm thinking, Clara, that this room tells a story. If we listen closely, the scarf, the brooch, the key, they're like threads in a tapestry. Pull one, and the whole pattern may unravel." Her needles resumed their soft clicking, a steady rhythm against the chaos of the crime scene. She would return to the suspects, to their words and their silences. But for now, the archive held her attention. Its secrets, she knew, were only beginning to speak. Chapter 4. The Guard's Tale. The lecture hall of St. Mary's Museum, with its high ceilings and rows of polished wooden chairs, felt colder as the morning wore on, the autumn light filtering weakly through tall windows. Miss Jane Marple sat in her usual unobtrusive corner, her knitting needles moving with a steady rhythm that belied the sharpness of her observations. Inspector Craddock, his notebook open and his expression one of quiet determination, had called Mr. Harold Gibbs, the night guard, back for a more thorough interview. The initial statements had been collected, but Craddock, with his methodical mind, knew that truth often lay in the details that emerged upon closer scrutiny. Miss Marple, though silent, was equally intent, her thoughts weaving through the morning's events like threads through her wool. Harold Gibbs stood before the inspector, his burly frame filling the space at the front of the hall. His uniform, though still crisp, seemed to strain slightly at the shoulders, as if he had grown broader with the weight of suspicion. His face, weathered and lined from years of night shifts, was set in a scowl, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. Miss Marple noted the way he stood, feet planted firmly, hands clasped behind his back, a stance that spoke of discipline, but also of someone bracing for a challenge. The smudge of dust on his boot, which she had noticed earlier, was still there, a faint gray mark against the polished black leather. It was a small thing, but in St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had learned that small things often carried great weight. "Mr. Gibbs," Craddock began, his voice calm but firm, "let's go over your movements again. You say you were on your rounds in the upper galleries when Miss Drake screamed. Can you be more precise about the time and what you were doing?" Gibbs shifted his weight, his boots creaking on the wooden floor. "Like I said, sir, it was around 9:30. I start my rounds at 9 sharp, checking the locks, windows, and display cases. The upper galleries take about 20 minutes, what with all the stairs. I was just finishing up near the medieval armor when I heard her scream. Came running down as fast as I could." He rubbed his knee, a gesture Miss Marple had seen before, and added, "These old bones don't move like they used to." Craddock's pen scratched across his notebook. "And you saw no one else in the galleries or near the archive?" "No, sir," Gibbs replied, his tone resolute. "Just Miss Drake, standing there in the archive doorway, looking like she'd seen a ghost. I told her to stay put and went to fetch Mrs. Bantry from the office upstairs." His eyes darted briefly to Miss Marple, then back to Craddock, as if wary of her quiet presence. Miss Marple's needles paused for a moment. She recalled a gardener in St. Mary Mead, Mr. Tompkins, who had always rubbed his back when questioned about missing tools, his complaints a distraction from his pilfering. Gibbs's knee-rubbing, she suspected, served a similar purpose, a habit to fill the silence, to deflect attention. She leaned forward slightly, her voice soft but clear. "Mr. Gibbs, your boots are remarkably well polished. A man of such care must take pride in his appearance. Yet there's a bit of dust on one heel, rather like the dust in the archive room, don't you think?" Gibbs's scowl deepened, and a flush crept up his neck. "Dust, ma'am? Well, I suppose I might have picked up some dirt on my rounds. This old place is full of it." His tone was gruff, but there was a defensive edge that did not escape Miss Marple's notice. Craddock, catching her hint, leaned forward. "Were you in the archive at any point this morning, Mr. Gibbs, before Miss Drake's scream?" "No, sir," Gibbs said quickly, his hands tightening behind his back. "I told you, I was upstairs. Didn't set foot in the archive till I heard her." He hesitated, then added, "Mr. Pritchard and we had our differences, mind you. He was always on about my rounds, saying I wasn't thorough enough, wanted me to check every corner twice. But that's no reason to do what was done." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. In her village, she had known a postman, Mr. Hale, who bristled at criticism of his deliveries, his pride masking a deeper resentment. Gibbs's mention of his disputes with Pritchard was voluntary, almost too readily offered, as if to preempt suspicion. She thought of the dust again, so specific to the archive's untouched corners, A guard on his rounds would pass through the public galleries, which were swept daily, not the archive's neglected floor. She filed the thought away, her expression serene. Craddock pressed further. What exactly were these differences with Mr. Pritchard? Gibbs shrugged, his shoulders hunching. He was a stickler, wasn't he? Always checking my logs, questioning why I took so long on the West Wing, said I spent too much time chatting with visitors instead of watching the exhibits. I told him, I've been here 15 years, never lost a single artifact, but he didn't trust me, kept threatening to cut my hours. His voice grew bitter, and he caught himself, forcing a neutral tone. Still, I did my job. I had no cause to harm him. Miss Marple's needles resumed their soft clicking. She thought of the archive room, its scattered papers and overturned chair suggesting a sudden, violent act. Gibbs's strength, evident in his broad frame, would have made short work of such a struggle. Yet the scarf, with its delicate embroidery, seemed an unlikely choice for a man like Gibbs, whose hands were calloused and practical. She wondered if he had seen something, or someone, during his rounds that he was not sharing. In St. Mary Mead, she had once unraveled a theft by noting a gardener's muddy boots in a clean parlor. Here, the dust on Gibbs's boot was equally telling. Craddock flipped through his notes. You mentioned Miss Drake's scream brought you to the archive. Did you notice anything unusual when you arrived? Anything out of place? Gibbs frowned, as if thinking hard. It was all a blur, sir. Mr. Pritchard was slumped over the table, that scarf around his neck. Miss Drake was shaking, barely able to speak. The room looked messy, papers on the floor, a chair tipped over. I didn't touch nothing, just told her to stay and went for help. He paused, then added, There was that brooch, though, sitting in its box, all shiny. Seemed odd it wasn't taken, if someone was after valuables. Miss Marple's eyes brightened at the mention of the brooch. Gibbs's observation, though casually offered, was astute. The brooch's presence, untouched amidst the chaos, was a puzzle in itself. She thought of a village jeweler, Mr. Perry, who had once been robbed but left a single gemstone behind, a deliberate act to mislead the police. Was the brooch left to distract, or because it held no value to the killer? She made a mental note to ask Craddock about its authenticity, her mind already turning to the other suspects. Craddock dismissed Gibbs with a nod, instructing him to remain available. As the guard shuffled out, his heavy steps echoing in the hall, Miss Marple turned to Mrs. Bantry, who had been listening intently from a nearby chair. Clara, dear, what do you know of Mr. Gibbs's habits? Does he often linger in the archive, perhaps to check on things? Mrs. Bantry frowned, her lace handkerchief twisting in her hands. Not that I've heard, Jane. He's usually in the galleries or the foyer, keeping an eye on visitors. The archive is Mr. Pritchard's domain, or was. Gibbs always said it was too dusty for his liking. She hesitated, then added, He's a reliable sort, though. Never misses a shift, even if he grumbles about the hours. Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts elsewhere. Reliable men, she knew, could have their own secrets. In St. Mary Mead, a dependable shopkeeper had once been caught hoarding stolen goods, his trustworthiness a mask for deceit. Gibbs's dust-smudged boot, his quick mention of his disputes with Pritchard, his insistence on being upstairs. They were threads in a tapestry she was beginning to weave. The scarf, too, lingered in her mind, its elegance out of place in Gibbs's practical world. Had he seen it before, perhaps on another's neck? Or had he carried it himself, a tool for a darker purpose? As Craddock prepared to call the next suspect, Miss Marple leaned back, her knitting a quiet rhythm against the tension in the room. "People are so careless with their stories," she murmured to herself, her eyes following Gibbs's retreating figure. The guard's tale was plausible, but human nature, she knew, was rarely so straightforward. The dust, the scarf, the untouched brooch, they were clues, small but insistent, and she would follow them until the truth emerged. Chapter 5. The Historian's Motive. The lecture hall of St. Mary's Museum, with its high windows and faint scent of polished wood, had taken on a somber air as the investigation into Mr. Ernest Pritchard's murder continued. The autumn light, now slanting through the panes, cast long shadows across the rows of chairs, where Miss Jane Marple sat quietly, her knitting needles clicking with a steady rhythm that seemed to anchor the room's tension. Inspector Craddock, his notebook filled with meticulous jottings, had called Dr. Evelyn Ward, the historian, for her interview. Miss Marple, permitted to observe as a courtesy to Mrs. Bantry, watched with keen interest, her mild demeanor masking the sharpness of her mind. Dr. Ward entered the hall with a measured step, her tweed suit crisp and her dark hair drawn back in a severe bun. Her wire-rimmed glasses glinted as she sat, her hands folded tightly in her lap, though Miss Marple noted the faint tremor as she adjusted those glasses, a gesture that had surfaced before, like a telltale ripple in still water. Dr. Ward was a woman of intellect and authority, her reputation built on meticulous research into Anglo-Saxon artifacts, but there was a brittleness to her composure, as if one sharp question might crack it. Miss Marple, who had known women like Dr. Ward in St. Mary Mead, scholars whose pride was both their strength and their vulnerability, watched her closely, her needles pausing briefly. "Dr. Ward," Craddock began, his tone even but probing, "you've told us you were in your office upstairs, working on a paper, when Mr. Pritchard was found. Can you confirm your movements this morning?" Dr. Ward nodded, her voice crisp despite the strain in her eyes. "Yes, Inspector. I arrived at the museum around 8, as I often do. I was in my office, drafting a piece on Anglo-Saxon metalwork for a journal. Mr. Pritchard and I had been collaborating on the cataloging of the new brooch, but I didn't see him this morning until I was called to the archive after Miss Drake's discovery." She adjusted her glasses again, her fingers lingering on the frames, and Miss Marple noted the slight flush that crept up her neck. Craddock leaned forward, his pen poised. "You worked closely with Mr. Pritchard. What was your relationship like?" Dr. Ward's lips tightened, a flicker of irritation crossing her face. "Professional, of course, though not without its challenges. Ernest, Mr. Pritchard, was a meticulous curator, but he could be infuriatingly dismissive. He often questioned my interpretations, as if his knowledge of artifacts was superior. It was frustrating, but we managed to work together." She paused, then added, "He was particularly fixated on the new brooch, insisting on verifying every detail of its provenance himself." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. In St. Mary Mead, she had known a librarian, Miss Harrow, whose scholarly pride had led her to conceal a mistake in her cataloging, a small deception that unraveled when a rival exposed it. Dr. Ward's defensiveness about Pritchard's scrutiny reminded her of that same fierce need to protect one's reputation. The brooch, Miss Marple suspected, was more than a professional project to the historian. It was a cornerstone of her credibility. Craddock flipped through his notes. "You mentioned the brooch. You were involved in its authentication, weren't you?" Dr. Ward hesitated, her hands tightening in her lap. "Yes, I reviewed the documentation provided by Mr. Crest, the donor. It's a remarkable piece. 8th century Anglo-Saxon, gold filigree with garnet inlays. I had no reason to doubt its authenticity. Ernest was the one who insisted on further tests, though I told him the provenance was sound." Her voice grew sharp, and she adjusted her glasses again, a gesture that seemed almost involuntary now. Miss Marple's needles slowed, her mind turning to the archive room, where Pritchard's body had been found with a magnifying glass in hand, and a sketch of the brooch marked with a question. Doubt, she knew, could be a dangerous spark in a world of academic rivalries. She thought of a village school teacher, Mrs. Lyle, who had once forged a reference to secure a position, her fear of exposure driving her to desperate measures. "Doctor." "Ward," Miss Marple said gently, her voice cutting through the room's tension. "You must be very proud of your work on the brooch. It's a significant find, isn't it? One that could enhance a scholar's reputation considerably." Dr. Ward's eyes met Miss Marple's, and for a moment a flicker of unease passed through them. "Yes, of course," she said, her tone guarded. "It's a rare piece, and my research on it will contribute significantly to the field. But I assure you, my interest is purely academic." She straightened as if to reclaim her authority, but Miss Marple noted the slight quiver in her voice, like a note struck off-key. Craddock, sensing the shift, pressed further. "Did you and Mr. Pritchard argue about the brooch, or about anything else recently?" Dr. Ward's flush deepened, though she kept her composure. "We had disagreements, as colleagues do. He was skeptical about the brooch's origins, which I found unnecessary. I told him the documentation was thorough, but he insisted on re-examining it himself. It was exasperating, but hardly a motive for anything drastic." She glanced at her hands, then quickly folded them again, as if to hide their tremor. Miss Marple's needles resumed their quiet rhythm. She thought of the scarf, its peacock feathers so vivid in the drab archive. It was a woman's scarf, she was certain, and Dr. Ward's elegance, her tailored suit, her carefully chosen accessories, suggested she might own such a thing. In St. Mary Mead, a vicar's wife, Mrs. Elton, had once used a bright shawl to distract from a petty theft, her flair for the dramatic a calculated misdirection. Was Dr. Ward's nervousness a sign of guilt, or merely the strain of being questioned? Craddock turned to a new page in his notebook. "Dr. Ward, were you in the archive at any point this morning, before the body was found?" "No," she said firmly, though her glasses slipped slightly, and she pushed them back with a quick gesture. "I was in my office, as I said. I only went to the archive when Mrs. Bantry summoned me after Miss Drake's scream." Her voice was steady now, but Miss Marple caught the slight pause before her answer, as if she were choosing her words with care. Mrs. Bantry, who had been listening from a nearby chair, leaned toward Miss Marple and whispered, "Evelyn's always been so particular, Jane. She and Ernest clashed often, but I never thought it was serious. She's devoted to her work, you know, lives for it." Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene but her mind racing. Devotion, she knew, could be a double-edged sword. In her village, a botanist, Mr. Crane, had once sabotaged a rival's research to protect his own standing. his obsession with his work blinding him to morality. Dr. Ward's passion for her field, coupled with Pritchard's doubts about the brooch, could have created a volatile mix. The historian's nervous gestures, her defensiveness about the brooch, they were threads in a pattern Miss Marple was beginning to discern. Craddock closed his notebook with a snap. "Thank you, Doctor. Ward, please remain available for further questions." As the historian rose, her movements stiff, Miss Marple watched her go, noting the way she adjusted her glasses one last time before leaving the hall. The gesture, so small, was like a signature, revealing more than Dr. Ward might realize. Mrs. Bantry turned to Miss Marple, her eyes wide. "Jane, you're awfully quiet. Do you think Evelyn could have—" Her voice trailed off, as if the thought were too shocking to complete. Miss Marple's smile was gentle but enigmatic. "People, Clara, are like books, full of chapters they don't always show. Dr. Ward's story is clear, but there are pages missing, I think." Her needles clicked softly, a counterpoint to her thoughts. The brooch, the scarf, the question mark in Pritchard's sketch, they were pieces of a puzzle, and Dr. Ward, with her scholarly pride and nervous hands, was at its center. Miss Marple would watch her closely, for in St. Mary Mead she had learned that those who guarded their reputations most fiercely often had the most to hide. Chapter 6. The Donor's Pride. The St. Mary's Museum, with its quiet galleries and air of solemnity, seemed to pulse with unspoken secrets as the investigation into Mr. Ernest Pritchard's murder pressed on. The lecture hall, where Inspector Craddock conducted his interviews, was bathed in the muted glow of late morning, the autumn sun casting a golden haze through the tall windows. Miss Jane Marple sat in her customary corner, her knitting needles moving with a gentle rhythm that contrasted with the tension in the room. Her eyes, sharp and bright behind her spectacles, followed every movement, every flicker of expression, as Mr. Lionel Crest, the wealthy donor, was called to give his account. Mr. Crest entered with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to deference, his tailored suit immaculate, and his silver hair swept back with a touch of theatrical flair. His gold watch chain glinted as he took his seat, and his smile, though polite, carried a hint of self-assurance that bordered on arrogance. In his early 60s, Crest was a figure of prominence in St. Mary Mead, his recent donation of the Anglo-Saxon brooch having elevated the museum's status and his own reputation as a benefactor. Yet Miss Marple, who had seen such charm in St. Mary Mead's squires and merchants, knew that pride could mask a multitude of motives. She noted the way Crest's fingers brushed the armrest, a restless gesture beneath his polished exterior. "Mr. Crest," Inspector Craddock began, his voice steady and professional. "You've told us you visited the archive this morning to discuss the brooch's display. Can you walk us through your movements in more detail?" Crest leaned back, crossing one leg over the other with deliberate ease. "Certainly, Inspector. I arrived at the museum shortly before 9, eager to see how Mr. Pritchard planned to showcase my donation. The brooch, you understand, is a family heirloom, passed down from my late wife's lineage, a piece of considerable historical and sentimental value. I found Pritchard in the archive, poring over his papers as usual. We spoke briefly about the display case and lighting, details, you know, to ensure the piece was properly presented. I left him alive and well, and I was in the main gallery, admiring the Roman artifacts, when I heard Miss Drake's scream. His voice was smooth, almost rehearsed, and he spread his hands as if to say the matter was straightforward. Craddock's pen moved across his notebook. "And what time did you leave the archive?" Crest tilted his head as if calculating. "It must have been around 9:15. Our conversation was short. Pritchard was preoccupied, muttering about tests and provenance. I didn't linger." He smiled faintly, but Miss Marple caught a flicker of unease in his eyes, quickly masked by his charm. She thought of Mr. Harrow, a wealthy landowner in St. Mary Mead, whose genial demeanor had hidden a ruthless streak when his investments were threatened. Crest's pride in the brooch, she suspected, was not merely sentimental. It was tied to his standing, his legacy. The handkerchief found near the archive door, monogrammed with his initials L.C., was a detail that nagged at her. When Craddock raised the point, Crest's smile tightened. "Oh, that," he said, waving a hand dismissively. "I must have dropped it during my visit. I'm forever misplacing things. My wife used to tease me about it." His laugh was light, but it rang hollow, and Miss Marple noted the way his fingers tightened briefly on the armrest, as if anchoring himself against scrutiny. "Rather a fine handkerchief to lose," Craddock remarked, holding up the evidence bag containing the silk square, its embroidered initials crisp and clear. "And found so near the archive door. Any idea how it got there?" Crest's eyes narrowed slightly, though his smile remained. "None at all, Inspector. Perhaps it fell from my pocket as I left. The archive is a dusty place. Things get misplaced." He shrugged, but Miss Marple's needles paused. In her village, she had once unraveled a case of stolen silver when a monogrammed glove was found in a garden shed, its owner's carelessness too convenient to be believed. Crest's handkerchief, she thought, was no accident. It was a clue, or perhaps a deliberate misstep. Craddock pressed further. "You mentioned Mr. Pritchard was preoccupied with the brooch's provenance. Did you discuss this with him?" Crest's expression grew guarded, though his voice remained smooth. "Briefly. He was always fussing over details, tests, comparisons, that sort of thing. I assured him the brooch's history was well documented, tracing back to my wife's family in Northumbria. He seemed satisfied, though he mentioned wanting to consult an expert. I thought it unnecessary, but Pritchard was a cautious man." He adjusted his cufflinks, a small gesture that Miss Marple found oddly deliberate, as if to draw attention to his wealth. She leaned forward slightly, her voice soft but clear. "Mr. Crest, the brooch must be very dear to you, given its connection to your late wife. It's a generous gift to the museum, but also a public one. Did Mr. Pritchard's doubts about its authenticity trouble you at all?" Crest's eyes met hers, and for a moment a flash of irritation crossed his face before he masked it with a smile. "Not in the least, Miss Marple. I have every confidence in the brooch's value. Pritchard's doubts were his own. Scholars, you know, can be overly pedantic. My wife cherished that piece, and I donated it in her memory. Its authenticity is beyond question." His tone was firm, but Miss Marple noted the slight tightening of his jaw, a sign of a man unused to being challenged. In St. Mary Mead, she had known a merchant, Mr. Baxter, whose pride in his family's heirlooms had blinded him to their flaws, leading to a bitter dispute when a forged painting was exposed. Crest's insistence on the brooch's authenticity, coupled with his quick dismissal of Pritchard's concerns, suggested a similar pride, one that might not tolerate scrutiny. The handkerchief, she thought, was a thread in a larger pattern, perhaps left to suggest a casual visit or to point suspicion elsewhere. Craddock flipped through his notes. "Did you see anyone else near the archive when you left? Miss Drake, perhaps? Or Dr. Ward?" Crest shook his head. "No one, Inspector. The museum was quiet, as it usually is at that hour. I passed Miss Drake in the main gallery later, scribbling in her notebook, but that was after I'd left the archive." He paused, then added, "She's a curious young woman, always hovering about. I believe she's quite taken with Dr. Ward's work." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. Crest's mention of Miss Drake was casual, but there was a hint of deflection in it, as if he wished to shift attention. She thought of the archive room, the silk scarf with its peacock feathers, and the untouched brooch. Crest's wealth and status made the scarf an unlikely weapon for him, but his presence in the archive, so close to the time of the murder, was troubling. Had he truly left Pritchard alive, or was his charm a veneer for something darker? Mrs. Bantry, seated nearby, leaned toward Miss Marple and whispered, "Lionel Crest is such a gentleman, Jane. Always so generous to the museum. Surely he wouldn't be involved in something so dreadful." Her voice held a note of hope, but also doubt, as if she sensed the cracks in Crest's polished facade. Miss Marple's smile was gentle but enigmatic. "Generosity, Clara, can sometimes be a mask. In my village, I've seen men give grand gifts to hide smaller sins." She thought of the brooch, its gleaming filigree, a symbol of Crest's pride. If Pritchard's doubts threatened that pride, or the legacy tied to it, what might a man like Crest do to protect it? The handkerchief, the brief visit, the insistence on the brooch's authenticity, they were pieces of a puzzle, and Miss Marple was beginning to see their shape. Craddock dismissed Crest with a nod, instructing him to remain available. As the donor rose, his movements graceful but deliberate, Miss Marple watched him go, her eyes lingering on the watch chain that glinted at his waist. In St. Mary Mead, she had once solved a mystery by noting a gentleman's pocket watch left behind at a scene of deceit. Crest's handkerchief, she suspected, was no less significant, a small thread in a tapestry of pride and pretense. She would follow it, as she followed all such threads, until the truth was laid bare. Chapter 7. The Visitor's Curiosity. The St. Mary's Museum, its quiet galleries now steeped in the somber hush of tragedy, seemed to hold secrets in every shadowed corner. The lecture hall, where Inspector Craddock conducted his interviews, was bathed in the pale light of an autumn afternoon, the high windows casting a soft glow over the polished wooden chairs. Miss Jane Marple sat in her unobtrusive corner, her knitting needles moving with their familiar, soothing rhythm, a counterpoint to the tension that hung in the air. Her eyes, bright and sharp behind her spectacles, missed nothing as Miss Susan Drake, the young visitor, was called to give her account of the morning's events. Mrs. Clara Bantry, still shaken but resolute, sat nearby, her lace handkerchief twisted in her hands as she watched the proceedings with a mix of curiosity and unease. Miss Drake entered the hall with a hesitant step, her brown hair tied back with a simple ribbon, and her hands clasped tightly before her. In her late 20s, she had the earnest air of a student, her face pale and her eyes wide with the shock of what she had witnessed. Her plain wool dress was neat but unremarkable, though Miss Marple noted the fresh ink stains on her fingers, a detail that spoke of more than casual note-taking. As Susan took her seat, Her gaze darted between Craddock and the floor, as if she were unsure of her place in such grave circumstances. Miss Marple, who had seen such nervous sincerity in St. Mary Mead's young women, knew that earnestness could hide as much as it revealed. "Miss Drake," Craddock began, his tone gentle but firm, "you've told us you were exploring the museum's exhibits when you found Mr. Pritchard's body. Can you take us through your movements this morning, step by step?" Susan nodded, her voice trembling slightly as she spoke. "I arrived at the museum just after it opened, around 9. I come here often, you see, to study the exhibits. I'm fascinated by local history, especially the Anglo-Saxon period. Dr. Ward's lectures have been so inspiring. She knows everything about that era." Her eyes lit briefly with enthusiasm, then dimmed as she continued. "I was in the main gallery, looking at the Roman coins, when I decided to see if I could glimpse the new brooch. I'd heard it was in the archive, and the door was ajar, so I went in." Her voice faltered, and she pressed a hand to her mouth. "That's when I saw Mr. Pritchard, slumped over the table with that scarf around his neck. I screamed, and Mr. Gibbs came running." Craddock's pen scratched across his notebook. "What time was this, Miss Drake?" She hesitated, her fingers twisting together. "It must have been around 9:30. I'd been in the gallery for a while, maybe 20 minutes. I didn't check my watch, but it felt like no time at all before I found him." Her eyes flickered to Miss Marple, then quickly away, as if unnerved by the old lady's quiet scrutiny. Miss Marple's needles slowed, her mind turning over Susan's words. The young woman's account was plausible, but there was a breathlessness to it, as if she were reciting a rehearsed story. In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had known a young seamstress, Miss Polly, whose eager explanations of a missing brooch had masked her own theft. Susan's ink-stained hands, so prominent against her pale skin, suggested she had been handling manuscripts or papers, perhaps in the archive itself, before her supposed discovery. Miss Marple made a mental note to inquire about the museum's visitor logs, wondering how often Susan's curiosity had drawn her to that restricted room. Craddock leaned forward, his expression probing. "You say the archive door was ajar. Did you see anyone else nearby before you entered?" Susan shook her head, her ribbon slipping slightly as she did. "No, Inspector. The hallway was empty. I thought it was strange the door was open, but I assumed Mr. Pritchard was inside working. I didn't mean to intrude. I just wanted a peek at the brooch." Her voice wavered, and she blinked rapidly, as if fighting tears. "It was so horrible, seeing him like that. I didn't touch anything, I swear. I just screamed and stayed there until Mr. Gibbs arrived." Miss Marple's eyes lingered on Susan's hands, the ink stains stark against her trembling fingers. "Miss Drake," she said softly, her voice cutting through the room like a gentle breeze. "You seem very fond of history. Do you often visit the archive, or was this a special occasion?" Susan's cheeks flushed, and she looked down at her hands as if noticing the stains for the first time. "Oh, no, ma'am. I don't usually go there. It's restricted, you know, for staff only. But I've always wanted to see the manuscripts up close. Dr. Ward sometimes lets me look at her notes during her lectures, and I thought the brooch might be on display in the archive." She faltered, her words tumbling over each other, and Miss Marple noted the way her gaze darted to the side, avoiding direct eye contact. In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had once unraveled a case of vandalism when a young clerk, Miss Turner, claimed to have stumbled upon a damaged statue, her nervous chatter revealing her own involvement. Susan's eagerness to explain her presence in the archive felt similar, a rush to fill the silence with innocence. The ink stains, Miss Marple thought, were a clue in themselves. The archive's manuscripts were handled with gloves to prevent damage, yet Susan's hands bore the marks of recent contact, unshielded and careless. Craddock flipped through his notes. You mentioned Dr. Ward's lectures. Are you close to her? Perhaps you've discussed the brooch with her? Susan's flush deepened, and she shook her head quickly. Not close, exactly, but I admire her work. She's so knowledgeable, and she's been kind enough to answer my questions sometimes. I asked her about the brooch once, after a lecture, and she said it was a significant find. I didn't know much about it, just that it was beautiful. Her voice trailed off, and she clasped her hands tightly, the ink stains disappearing into the folds of her dress. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her mind turning to the scarf, its peacock feathers so vivid in the archive's drab light. Susan's plain attire made such a scarf unlikely for her, but her admiration for Dr. Ward suggested a connection, perhaps a borrowed item, or a gift from a mentor. In her village, a young governess, Miss Lane, had once worn her employer's shawl to impress a suitor, a small act that led to a larger deception. Was Susan's presence in the archive truly a matter of curiosity, or had she been drawn there by something or someone else? Craddock's tone grew sharper. Miss Drake, did you notice anything unusual in the archive when you found Mr. Pritchard? Anything out of place besides the body? Susan hesitated, her eyes flickering to the floor. It was all so shocking, Inspector. The papers were scattered, and a chair was overturned, but I didn't look closely. The brooch was there, in its box, shining under the light. I thought it was odd it hadn't been taken if someone meant to rob the place. She paused, then added, There was a key, too, on the floor. I didn't touch it, but I saw it near the papers. Craddock's eyes narrowed. A key? You didn't mention that before. Susan's hands twisted together and she looked flustered. I forgot. It was all so overwhelming. It was small, like for a lockbox. I didn't think it was important. Her voice was barely above a whisper, and Miss Marple noted the way. Her shoulders hunched, as if she wished to shrink from the room. Mrs. Bantry leaned toward Miss Marple, her voice low. Poor girl, Jane. She's terrified. She's just a visitor, caught up in this awful business. Surely she's not involved. Her tone was hopeful, but there was a trace of doubt, as if she sensed the gaps in Susan's story. Miss Marple's smile was gentle, but guarded. Curiosity, Clara, can lead one to unexpected places. In my village, I've seen young women wander into trouble simply by wanting to know more than they should. She thought of the archive, the open door, the ink-stained hands. Susan's story was one of innocence, but innocence, she knew, could be a carefully crafted guise. The key, mentioned so belatedly, was another thread in the tapestry, and Miss Marple wondered if Susan had seen it before, her scream, or if she had placed it there herself. Craddock dismissed Susan with a nod, instructing her to remain available. As she left, her steps quick and uneven, Miss Marple watched her go, her needles moving steadily. The young woman's nervous energy, her ink-stained hands, her sudden recollection of the key. They were pieces of a puzzle, and Miss Marple was beginning to see their edges. The scarf, the brooch, the archive's quiet chaos, they all pointed to a truth hidden in plain sight, and she would unravel it, one careful stitch at a time. Chapter 8. A pattern emerges. The St. Mary's Museum, its galleries now cloaked in the soft gloom of late afternoon, seemed to whisper secrets through its ancient walls. Miss Jane Marple sat in the cozy parlor of Mrs. Clara Bantry's home, a short walk from the museum, where the two women had retreated for tea after the day's interviews. The parlor was warm and inviting, with chintz curtains and a crackling fire, a stark contrast to the cold tension of the museum's lecture hall. Miss Marple's knitting needles moved with their usual steady rhythm, the soft click a counterpoint to her racing thoughts. Mrs. Bantry, her cheeks flushed from both the fire and her agitation, poured tea with a clatter of china, her mind still reeling from the events at the museum. "Jane, it's simply dreadful," Mrs. Bantry said, setting the teapot down with a thud. "Poor Mr. Pritchard, strangled in our little museum, and all those people, Gibbs, Dr. Ward, Mr. Crest, Miss Drake, any one of them could be hiding something. What do you make of it?" Her eyes, wide with curiosity, fixed on Miss Marple, who sipped her tea with a serene expression that belied the sharpness of her mind. Miss Marple set her cup down carefully, her gaze drifting to the fire. "People, Clara, are like tapestries, full of threads that seem tangled until you step back and see the pattern. Each of our suspects has given us a piece of their story, but it's the small things, the inconsistencies, that begin to form a picture." Her voice was soft, almost musing, but there was a steel beneath it, honed by years of unraveling human frailties in St. Mary Mead. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, her handkerchief clutched tightly. "Inconsistencies? Oh, do tell, Jane. You always see things no one else does." Miss Marple's needles paused, and she folded her hands in her lap, her eyes bright with thought. "Let us consider what we know," she began. "Mr. Pritchard was strangled with a silk scarf, an elegant thing with peacock feathers, not the sort of weapon one chooses on impulse. It was deliberate, chosen for its strength and silence, and left looped on a hook as if to be noticed. The archive room showed signs of a struggle, scattered papers, an overturned chair, but it was contained, suggesting the act was swift and planned. The brooch, so central to the morning's events, was left untouched in its box, which is curious if robbery was the motive. And then there's the key, found under the table, small and tarnished, perhaps for a lockbox or private drawer. These are our threads, Clara, and they weave a story." She took another sip of tea, her mind sifting through the suspects' accounts. "Mr. Gibbs, the guard, claims he was on his rounds in the upper galleries, yet the dust on his boot matches the archive's floor, a place he says he never entered until Miss Drake's scream. His disputes with Pritchard over his work suggest resentment, but the scarf seems an unlikely choice for a man of his practical nature." Dr. Ward, the historian, was defensive about the brooch's provenance, her nervous habit of adjusting her glasses betraying anxiety. Her scholarly pride could be a motive if Pritchard's doubts threatened her reputation. Mr. Crest, the donor, insists the brooch is a family heirloom, yet his handkerchief, found near the archive door, suggests a connection he dismisses too readily. And Miss Drake, the visitor, with her ink-stained hands and belated mention of the key, seems more involved than her curiosity explains. Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened. "You think one of them is lying, Jane? But who? They all seem so ordinary in their way." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her needles resuming their rhythm. "Ordinary people, Clara, can do extraordinary things when driven by fear or ambition. In St. Mary Mead, I once knew a baker, Mr. Tuttle, who seemed the most ordinary soul until a forged receipt exposed his theft. It's the small things that betray them, the dust, the handkerchief, the ink stains. She paused, her thoughts turning to the scarf. That scarf, Clara, is particularly telling. It's a woman's scarf, I'm certain, and its presence in the archive is no accident. It was either brought there deliberately or taken from someone close to the scene. Mrs. Bantry gasped, her teacup rattling in its saucer. You think it belongs to one of them? Dr. Ward, perhaps, or Miss Drake? Oh, Jane, you're making my head spin. Miss Marple's expression remained serene, but her mind was far from still. She thought of the brooch, its gleaming filigree a focal point for so much attention. During a recent visit to her nephew Raymond, an art dealer, she had listened to him speak of the growing market for forged artifacts, where a single piece could make or break a reputation. The brooch, she said softly, is at the heart of this, I think. Mr. Pritchard's notes, with that question mark beside the sketch, suggest he doubted its authenticity. If it were a forgery, it would be a blow to someone, perhaps to Dr. Ward's scholarship, or to Mr. Crest's pride, or even to Miss Drake's admiration for her mentor. She set her knitting aside and leaned forward, her voice low but clear. Clara, do you recall the scandal in our village some years ago, when a forged painting was sold at the church fete? The artist, a quiet man, was so desperate to protect his name that he went to great lengths to silence a critic. I wonder if something similar happened here. A hamisitas, hakiderul, tunkre tehet egi kariert vagi egi orokseget. Pritchard's death may have been to keep such a secret buried. Mrs. Bantry's mouth fell open. A forgery? The brooch? But Mr. Crest said it was his wife's heirloom, and Dr. Ward verified it. Surely they wouldn't. Her voice trailed off, as if the implications were too much to bear. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes distant. People will go to great lengths to protect what they hold dear, Clara, whether it's a reputation, a memory, or a fortune. I think it would be wise to have the brooch examined by an expert, someone impartial. If it's not what it seems, we may find the motive for this terrible act. She turned to Mrs. Bantry, her tone gentle but firm. Would you ask Inspector Craddock to arrange for such a test? I believe it could be most illuminating. Mrs. Bantry nodded eagerly, her earlier distress giving way to a spark of excitement. I'll speak to him at once, Jane. Oh, you're clever. How do you think of these things? Miss Marple's smile was modest, but her mind was already weaving the next thread. The scarf, the key, the untouched brooch, they were not random elements, but part of a deliberate design. In St. Mary Mead, she had once solved a mystery by noticing a misplaced button, a tiny clue that led to a larger truth. Here the pattern was emerging, and she felt the familiar stir of intuition. The killer, she suspected, had acted to protect something vital. A secret tied to the brooch, perhaps, or to the pride and fear it represented. As Mrs. Bantry bustled off to find Craddock, Miss Marple picked up her knitting, her needles moving with quiet precision. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the parlor walls, and she thought of the archive room, its silent chaos, a mirror to the human heart. The truth, she murmured to herself, is like a stitch, small but essential. Pull one, and the whole fabric unravels. She would wait and watch and listen, for the pattern was there, waiting to be seen. Chapter 9. The Brooch's Secret. The St. Mary's Museum, its galleries now dimmed by the encroaching dusk, seemed to hold its breath as the investigation into Mr. Ernest Pritchard's murder deepened. Miss Jane Marple, having returned from Mrs. Bantry's parlor to the museum, sat in a quiet corner of the curator's office, a small room adjacent to the archive, where Inspector Craddock had set up a temporary command post. The office was cluttered with books and files, its walls adorned with faded maps of Anglo-Saxon sites, a testament to Pritchard's meticulous nature. Miss Marple's knitting needles moved with their familiar rhythm, the soft click a steady undercurrent to the murmur of police activity. Her eyes, bright and discerning, took in every detail, from the neatly stacked ledgers to the faint scent of ink that lingered in the air. Inspector Craddock, his face etched with the strain of the case, had acted on Miss Marple's suggestion to have the Anglo-Saxon brooch examined by an expert. A specialist from London, Dr. Margaret Henshaw, had arrived that afternoon, her brisk manner and sharp eyes marking her as a woman of authority. She now stood at a table in the office, her tools spread out, a loop, a small scale, and a notebook filled with precise handwriting. The brooch, removed from its velvet-lined box, lay under a bright lamp, its gold filigree gleaming with an almost defiant allure. Mrs. Bantry, hovering nearby, wrung her hands, her earlier excitement tempered by a growing unease as the expert worked. Miss Marple watched Dr. Henshaw closely, her mind turning over the threads of the case. The brooch, she suspected, was the pivot around which the murder turned, its significance tied to the motives of pride, ambition, or fear. In St. Mary Mead, she had once unraveled a scandal involving a forged locket, its exposure shattering a family's reputation. Here, the brooch's authenticity, or lack thereof, could hold the key to Mr. Pritchard's death. She thought of the curator's notes, with their question mark beside the brooch's sketch, and the silk scarf, its peacock feathers a vivid clue in the archive's drab light. Dr. Henshaw adjusted her loop, her expression intent as she examined the brooch's surface. After a long silence, she straightened, her face grave. "Inspector," she said, her voice clipped and professional. "This brooch is not what it appears to be. The filigree is well crafted, and the garnets are genuine, but the base metal is not gold. It's a high-quality alloy, plated to deceive. The craftsmanship is modern, likely no older than a decade. It's a forgery, and a clever one, but not an 8th century artifact." A murmur rippled through the room. Mrs. Bantry gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. A forgery? But Mr. Crest said it was his wife's heirloom, and Dr. Ward verified it. Her voice trembled, as if the revelation were a personal betrayal to the museum's honor. Craddock's eyes narrowed, his pen poised over his notebook. "You're certain, Dr. Henshaw? There's no mistake?" "None," Dr. Henshaw replied, her tone firm. "I've seen similar forgeries in private collections, designed to fool all but the closest scrutiny. Whoever created this knew their craft, but they couldn't replicate the patina of true age. Mr. Pritchard's notes, which you showed me, suggest he suspected as much. His tests on the metal composition were incomplete, but he was on the right track." Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind racing. Pritchard's doubts, marked by that question mark in his sketch, had been dangerous. In St. Mary Mead, a jeweler, Mr. Perry, had once been threatened for questioning a fake gemstone, his insistence on the truth nearly costing him his life. Here, Pritchard's scrutiny of the brooch had likely led to his murder, a desperate act to silence a truth that could ruin someone's standing. But whose? Craddock turned to Miss Marple, his expression one of respect tempered by curiosity. "Miss Marple, you suggested this test. What made you think the brooch might be a forgery?" She smiled faintly, her hands resting on her knitting. "It was a small thing, Inspector, the question mark in Mr. Pritchard's notes, and the fact that the brooch was left untouched in the archive. If robbery were the motive, it would have been taken. But if its value was a lie, then its presence was a distraction, meant to mislead. I've seen such deceptions before, in my village, where a forged document nearly tore a family apart. People will kill to protect a lie, especially one tied to pride or reputation." Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened. "Jane, you think someone killed Mr. Pritchard to hide this? But who? Mr. Crest, who donated it, or Dr. Ward, who vouched for it?" Miss Marple's expression remained serene, but her thoughts were sharp. "We must consider all possibilities, Clara. Mr. Crest's pride in the brooch is clear, but a forgery would tarnish his legacy, especially if he knew of it. Dr. Ward's reputation rests on her scholarship. Her verification of the brooch was public, and a mistake would be ruinous. Even Miss Drake, with her admiration for Dr. Ward, might have stumbled into something she shouldn't have. And Mr. Gibbs, though practical, might have seen more than he claims." Craddock nodded, his gaze returning to Dr. Henshaw. "Can you tell us anything about who might have made this forgery?" Dr. Henshaw shook her head. "It's expert work, likely commissioned by someone with knowledge of Anglo-Saxon design. Forgers of this caliber are rare, often working for private collectors or dealers. The documentation provided with the brooch, Mr. Crest's family records, would need to be examined closely. They may be forged as well." Craddock made a note, then turned to a constable. "Summon Mr. Crest and Dr. Ward. We need to hear their reactions to this." As the constable hurried off, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the suspects. She recalled Dr. Ward's nervous adjustment of her glasses when questioned about the brooch, and Mr. Crest's quick dismissal of his handkerchief's presence near the archive. Both had stakes in the brooch's authenticity, but whose was greater? Mr. Crest arrived first, his tailored suit as impeccable as ever, though his face betrayed a flicker of unease as he saw the brooch under Dr. Henshaw's lamp. "Inspector, what's this about?" he asked, his voice smooth but edged with tension. Craddock's tone was measured. "Mr. Crest, Dr. Henshaw has examined the brooch. It's a forgery, modern work disguised as an Anglo-Saxon artifact. Can you explain this?" Crest's smile vanished, replaced by a flush of anger. "A forgery? That's absurd. This brooch belonged to my late wife's family, passed down for generations. I had it appraised before donating it. Pritchard himself confirmed its value." His hands clenched, and Miss Marple noted the way his watch chain glinted as he leaned forward, as if to assert his authority. Dr. Ward entered moments later, her face pale as she took in the scene. When Craddock repeated the revelation, her reaction was starkly different. Her glasses slipped, and she caught them with trembling hands, her voice barely above a whisper. "A forgery? That's impossible. I reviewed the documentation myself. It was thorough, impeccable." She sank into a chair, her composure crumbling, and Miss Marple watched her closely, noting the fear in her eyes, not just surprise, but something deeper, like dread. In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had seen a scholar, Mr. Crane, unravel when his forged botanical drawings were exposed, his career destroyed by his own ambition. Dr. Ward's reaction suggested a similar stake, perhaps a fear of ruin if her verification was proven false. Crest's anger, meanwhile, could be genuine, or a performance to deflect suspicion. Miss Marple thought of the scarf, its peacock feathers so vivid in her memory. It was a woman's scarf, and Dr. Ward's elegance made her a likely candidate, though Miss Drake's nervous devotion could not be dismissed. Craddock turned to Dr. Ward. "You vouched for the brooch's authenticity, Doctor." "Ward, did you suspect anything amiss?" She shook her head, her voice unsteady. "No, Inspector. The records were convincing, and the craftsmanship seemed authentic. I trusted them." Her hands twisted in her lap, and Miss Marple noted the absence of her usual poise, as if the revelation had stripped away her defenses. Crest interjected, his voice sharp. "If there's a forgery, it's Pritchard's doing. He must have switched the brooch to discredit me. I won't have my wife's legacy tarnished." His indignation was fierce, but Miss Marple caught a flicker of calculation in his eyes, as if he were gauging their reactions. Mrs. Bantry, unable to contain herself, turned to Miss Marple. "Jane, this is shocking. A forgery right under our noses. Do you think one of them knew?" Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her expression calm but her mind alight. "A secret like this, Clara, is a heavy burden. Someone knew or suspected, and Mr. Pritchard paid the price for it. The scarf, the key, the untouched brooch, they all point to a truth we're close to uncovering." She thought of the archive, its silent clues waiting to be read. The pattern was clearer now, and she felt the familiar stir of intuition. The brooch's secret was out, but the killer's was still hidden, woven into the fabric of pride, fear, and deception. Chapter 10. A Village Parallel. The St. Mary's Museum, its stone walls now cloaked in the deepening shadows of evening, seemed to hold its secrets more tightly as the investigation into Mr. Ernest Pritchard's murder pressed forward. Miss Jane Marple had returned to Mrs. Clara Bantry's parlor, where the warmth of the fire and the comfort of a second pot of tea provided a brief respite from the day's revelations. The room was a haven of familiarity, with its chintz cushions and framed watercolors of St. Mary Mead's countryside, yet Miss Marple's mind was far from restful. Her knitting needles moved with their steady rhythm, the soft click a counterpoint to the whirl of her thoughts as she pieced together the threads of the case. Mrs. Bantry, her earlier shock at the brooch's forgery, now tempered by curiosity, sat across from her, her hands fidgeting with a teaspoon. "Jane, I can't stop thinking about that brooch," she said, her voice a mix of indignation and excitement. "A forgery, right here in our museum, and poor Mr. Pritchard killed to keep it secret, you think? But who would do such a thing? Mr. Crest was so furious, and Dr. Ward looked as if she'd seen a ghost." Miss Marple's eyes, bright and discerning behind her spectacles, flickered to the fire. "Human nature, Clara, is much the same everywhere," she said softly. "In St. Mary Mead, I've seen pride and fear drive people to desperate acts, just as they might here. The brooch's secret is a key, but it's the motives behind it, pride, ambition, shame, that weave the pattern." Her voice was gentle, but there was a quiet certainty in it, honed by years of observing the frailties of her village neighbors. She set her knitting aside, her hands folding neatly in her lap as she leaned forward. "Let me tell you a story, Clara. From our village, some years ago, there was a man, Mr. Langley, a quiet artist who painted landscapes for the church fete. He was well liked, unassuming, but he had a secret. He'd been passing off forged paintings as works by a minor master. When a collector, Mr. Vance, began to suspect the truth, Langley grew desperate. He didn't kill, thank goodness, but he went to great lengths, stealing letters, spreading rumors, to silence Vance and protect his reputation. In the end, a misplaced sketchbook betrayed him, a small thing that unraveled his deception. Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened, her teaspoon forgotten. "Jane, you think it's like that here? Someone forged the brooch and killed Mr. Pritchard to keep it hidden?" Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene, but her mind sharp. "I think it very likely, Clara. Mr. Pritchard's notes, with that question mark beside the brooch's sketch, show he was close to uncovering the truth. The scarf, so deliberately chosen and left on display, suggests a calculated act, not a crime of passion. The key found under the table, the untouched brooch, the scattered papers, they all point to someone desperate to protect a lie, one tied to the brooch's authenticity." She paused, sipping her tea, her thoughts turning to the suspects. "Mr. Gibbs, the guard, has the strength for such an act, but the dust on his boot suggests he was in the archive after the fact, perhaps stumbling upon the scene. His resentment toward Pritchard was real, but the scarf doesn't suit him. Mr. Crest, with his pride in the brooch as a family heirloom, would be humiliated by a forgery, especially if he knew of it. His handkerchief, found so conveniently near the archive, feels staged, like a misdirection. Miss Drake, with her ink-stained hands and nervous devotion to Dr. Ward, might have been drawn into something beyond her curiosity. Perhaps she saw more than she admits. But Dr. Ward? Miss Marple's voice trailed off, her eyes narrowing. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, her voice hushed. "Doctor? Ward? You think she's the one, Jane? She was so shaken when the brooch was called a forgery." Miss Marple's needles resumed their soft clicking. "Shaken, yes, but there was fear in her eyes, Clara, not just surprise. In St. Mary Mead, I knew a school teacher, Miss Ellis, who forged a certificate to secure her position. When a colleague began to suspect, she became a shadow of herself, her nerves betraying her guilt. Dr. Ward's nervous habit of adjusting her glasses, her defensiveness about the brooch's provenance, it's familiar. Her reputation as a historian rests on her work, and a public error, especially one tied to a forgery, would be ruinous. If she forged the brooch or knew of its falsity, and Pritchard's doubts threatened to expose her, she might have acted to silence him. Mrs. Bantry gasped, her teacup rattling in its saucer. "But the scarf, Jane? Could it be hers? It's so elegant, with those peacock feathers, exactly the sort of thing Evelyn might wear." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts returning to the archive. "The scarf is a woman's, I'm certain, and Dr. Ward's elegance makes her a likely candidate. Yet we mustn't rush to conclusions. Miss Drake, with her admiration for Dr. Ward, might have borrowed such a scarf, or even placed it there to protect her mentor. In my village, a young maid, Miss Carter, once used her mistress's shawl to deflect suspicion from herself. We must find out who owns that scarf, Clara. It's a vital thread." She leaned back, her eyes distant as she considered the key found under the table. The key, too, is puzzling. Miss Drake mentioned it belatedly, as if it slipped her mind, yet it was near the papers, half hidden. It suggests something private, a lockbox, perhaps, where Pritchard kept sensitive notes. If Dr. Ward feared what those notes contained, she might have acted swiftly, using the scarf to ensure silence. Miss Marple thought of the archive's scattered papers, the overturned chair, the magnifying glass in Pritchard's hand. The scene spoke of a sudden, desperate act, yet one planned enough to choose a silent weapon. Mrs. Bantry's voice broke her reverie. "Jane, what should we do? Should I tell Inspector Craddock your suspicions?" Miss Marple's smile was gentle but firm. "Not yet, Clara. We need more than suspicions. We need evidence. The scarf must be traced, and the key's purpose uncovered. I'd suggest asking the museum staff if they've seen Dr. Ward or Miss Drake with such a scarf, or if Pritchard kept a private lockbox. And the brooch's documentation, Mr. Crest's family records, should be examined closely. If they're forged, it may point to who stood to lose the most." Mrs. Bantry nodded eagerly, her earlier distress giving way to determination. "I'll speak to the staff tomorrow, Jane, and I'll ask Craddock about those records." "Oh, you're clever. How do you see these things?" Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her expression serene. "It's only a matter of looking, Clara, and remembering. Human nature doesn't change, whether in a village or a museum. Pride, fear, ambition, they leave traces, like footprints in the dust." She thought of the archive, its quiet chaos, a mirror to the human heart. The pattern was clearer now, the threads of the scarf, the key, and the forged brooch weaving together. Dr. Ward's fear, Crest's pride, Drake's nervousness, Gibbs's dust-smudged boot, they were all part of the tapestry, and Miss Marple was determined to follow each thread to its source. As the fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the parlor walls, Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind alight with possibilities. The truth, she knew, was close, hidden in the small things, the nervous gesture, the misplaced item, the lie told too smoothly. She would wait and watch and knit until the pattern emerged in full. Chapter 11. The Scarf's Owner. The St. Mary's Museum, its galleries now shrouded in the quiet of early evening, seemed to hold its breath as the investigation into Mr. Ernest Pritchard's murder drew closer to its heart. Miss Jane Marple, having spent the afternoon reflecting on the case in Mrs. Bantry's parlor, had returned to the museum at Inspector Craddock's request. The curator's office, a cramped space filled with the scent of old books and ink, served as a temporary hub for the police, its walls lined with maps and shelves that bore the weight of Pritchard's meticulous work. Miss Marple sat near a small desk, her knitting needles moving with their familiar rhythm, the soft click a steady counterpoint to the murmur of activity around her. Her eyes, sharp and discerning, took in every detail, from the flicker of a constable's lantern to the faint creak of the floorboards underfoot. Inspector Craddock, his face lined with the strain of the day's revelations, had called a meeting to discuss new evidence. The brooch's forgery, confirmed by Dr. Henshaw, had shifted the case, casting suspicion on those tied to its authenticity, Mr. Crest, Dr. Ward, and to a lesser extent, Miss Drake. But it was the silk scarf, with its vivid peacock feathers, that held Miss Marple's attention. Its elegance, so out of place in the dusty archive, was a deliberate clue, she was certain, and its owner was the key to unraveling the murder. Mrs. Bantry, ever eager to assist, stood nearby, her hands clasped tightly as she listened to Craddock's briefing. "Miss Marple," Craddock began, his voice low but clear, "your suggestion about the brooch was spot on, and now we've got another lead. One of the museum staff, a cleaner named Mrs. Tuttle, came forward this afternoon. She claims she saw a doctor. Ward wearing a scarf with peacock feathers yesterday, during a meeting in the archive. She's certain it's the same one used in the murder. He held up the evidence bag, the scarf's vibrant colors muted through the plastic but unmistakable. Mrs. Bantry gasped, her eyes wide. Evelyn's scarf? Oh, Jane, you were right to focus on it, but surely she wouldn't. Would she? Miss Marple's needles paused, her expression serene but her mind racing. It's a significant detail, Clara, she said softly. A scarf like that is not easily misplaced, nor is it a common choice for a weapon. If it belongs to Dr. Ward, it ties her to the scene in a way she cannot easily dismiss. She thought of a saint, Mary Mead seamstress, Mrs. Price, who had once left a distinctive ribbon at the scene of a petty theft, her carelessness betraying her. The scarf, Miss Marple suspected, was no accident. It was either a deliberate act or a desperate oversight. Craddock nodded, his notebook open. We've asked Dr. Ward to join us. I'd like you to observe. Miss Marple, you've a knack for seeing what's beneath the surface. He turned to a constable. Bring her in. Dr. Evelyn Ward entered the office, her face pale, and her usual composure frayed at the edges. Her tweed suit was as crisp as ever, but her hands trembled as she adjusted her wire-rimmed glasses, a gesture Miss Marple had come to recognize as a sign of her unease. She sat stiffly, her eyes darting to the evidence bag on the desk, and Miss Marple noted the way her breath caught, as if she already knew what was coming. Dr. Ward, Craddock said, his tone firm but measured. We've had a witness confirm that you were seen wearing a silk scarf with peacock feathers yesterday in the archive. This scarf, he gestured to the bag, was used to strangle Mr. Pritchard. Can you explain how it came to be in the archive this morning? Dr. Ward's face drained of color, and her hands clenched in her lap. That's my scarf, yes, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I wore it yesterday, but I lost it. I thought I'd left it in my office or perhaps in the lecture hall. Someone must have taken it. Her eyes flickered to Miss Marple, then back to Craddock, and she adjusted her glasses again, her fingers shaking. I had nothing to do with Ernest's death, I swear it. Miss Marple's needles slowed, her mind turning over Dr. Ward's words. The admission was swift, but the claim of loss felt too convenient, like a story prepared in advance. In St. Mary Mead, a vicar's wife, Mrs. Elton, had once claimed a stolen brooch was lost to deflect suspicion, only for it to be found hidden in her sewing basket. Dr. Ward's nervousness, her quick excuse, suggested a similar attempt to distance herself from the evidence. Yet the scarf's presence in the archive, looped so deliberately on the hook, spoke of intent, not carelessness. Craddock leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. You're saying someone stole your scarf and used it to commit murder? That's a serious claim, Doctor. Ward, did you see anyone take it or notice it missing before this morning? Dr. Ward shook her head, her voice unsteady. No, I didn't realize it was gone until late yesterday. I looked for it in my office, but I thought I'd misplaced it. I often leave things lying about when I'm working. She paused, then added, Ernest and I had a meeting in the archive yesterday, discussing the brooch. I might have left it there, but I don't recall. Surely you don't think I'd use my own scarf to do such a thing. Miss Marple's eyes brightened, though her expression remained gentle. Doctor. Ward, she said softly. You mentioned meeting Mr. Pritchard in the archive yesterday. Was the brooch discussed at length? Perhaps his doubts about its authenticity? Dr. Ward's flush deepened, and she adjusted her glasses again, her hands betraying her agitation. We discussed the cataloging, yes. He was skeptical, as always, insisting on further tests. I told him the documentation was sound, but he wouldn't listen. It was frustrating, but not unusual. Her voice grew sharp, and she caught herself, forcing a calmer tone. I had no reason to harm him. My work speaks for itself. Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts returning to the brooch's forgery, confirmed by Dr. Henshaw. Dr. Ward's reputation as a historian rested on her verification of the artifact, and Pritchard's doubts would have threatened her standing. In St. Mary Mead, a scholar, Mr. Crane, had once sabotaged a rival's work to protect his own name, his desperation leading to reckless acts. Dr. Ward's fear, so evident in her trembling hands, suggested a similar motive, perhaps a forgery of her own making, or one she had failed to detect, now exposed by Pritchard's scrutiny. Craddock flipped through his notes. Mrs. Tuttle also mentioned seeing you in the archive this morning, before Miss Drake's scream. You said you were in your office. Can you explain that? Dr. Ward's eyes widened, and she shook her head vehemently. That's not true. I was in my office all morning until Mrs. Bantry called me down. Mrs. Tuttle must be mistaken. Her voice rose, and Miss Marple noted the desperation in it, like a cornered animal seeking escape. Mrs. Bantry, unable to stay silent, leaned toward Miss Marple. Jane, Mrs. Tuttle is reliable. She's been cleaning the museum for years. Could Dr. Ward be lying? Her whisper was urgent, her eyes fixed on the historian. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her mind weaving the threads together. It's possible, Clara, she murmured. But we must consider all angles. The scarf ties Dr. Ward to the scene, but Miss Drake's presence in the archive, her ink-stained hands, and her belated mention of the key suggest she, too, may know more. And Mr. Gibbs's dust-smudged boot places him there after the fact, perhaps as a witness to something he hasn't shared. She thought of the archive, its scattered papers and overturned chair, the scarf a vivid clue in its quiet chaos. The pattern was nearly complete, but one piece remained elusive. Craddock dismissed Dr. Ward, instructing her to remain available. As she left, her steps unsteady, Miss Marple turned to Mrs. Bantry. Clara, we must learn more about that scarf. Ask Mrs. Tuttle if she saw it on anyone else, Miss Drake, perhaps, or even Mr. Crest. And the key, has it been traced to a lock yet? Mrs. Bantry nodded, her face alight with purpose. I'll do it first thing tomorrow, Jane. Oh, you're brilliant. How do you think of these things? Miss Marple's smile was gentle but enigmatic. It's only a matter of watching, Clara, and seeing what others overlook. The scarf is a thread, and it will lead us to the truth. Her needles resumed their rhythm, a steady pulse against the mystery's heart. The scarf's owner was known, but the motive, tied to the forged brooch and Pritchard's dangerous doubts, was still a shadow, waiting to be brought into the light. Chapter 12. The Confession. The St. Mary's Museum, its stone walls now bathed in the soft glow of morning, stood as a silent witness to the unraveling of its dark secret. Miss Jane Marple had requested a final gathering in the museum's reading room, a quiet space with tall bookshelves and a long oak table, where the scent of old paper mingled with the faint chill of autumn. Inspector Craddock, trusting her uncanny insight, had agreed to assemble the suspects, Mr. Harold Gibbs, Dr. Evelyn Ward, Mr. Lionel Crest, and Miss Susan Drake, for what he hoped would be the case's resolution. Mrs. Clara Bantry, her nerves tempered by anticipation, sat beside Miss Marple, her eyes darting between the suspects as they took their places. Miss Marple's knitting needles lay still in her lap, a rare pause as her sharp eyes surveyed the room, her mind weaving the final threads of the tapestry she had been piecing together. The reading room was hushed, the only sound the faint creak of chairs as the suspects settled, each bearing the weight of suspicion. Gibbs, the guard, sat stiffly, his burly frame tense and his dust-smudged boot hidden beneath the table. Dr. Ward, her face pale and her glasses slipping, clutched her hands tightly, her nervous tic more pronounced than ever. Crest, his tailored suit impeccable, maintained a veneer of calm, though his fingers drummed lightly on the table's edge. Miss Drake, her ink-stained hands folded in her lap, looked small and frightened, her eyes flickering toward Dr. Ward with a mix of loyalty and fear. Miss Marple noted each detail, her expression serene, but her thoughts as precise as a needle's point. Inspector Craddock stood at the head of the table, his notebook closed, his voice steady. "We've gathered you here," he began, "because new evidence has come to light, and Miss Marple has some observations to share. The murder of Mr. Pritchard was no random act. It was tied to a secret, one we've now uncovered." He nodded to Miss Marple, who rose, her small figure commanding the room with quiet authority. "Thank you, Inspector," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but clear, like a bell in the stillness. "This case, like so many, is a matter of human nature, of pride, fear, and the lengths to which people will go to protect what they hold dear. In my village, St. Mary Mead, I've seen such motives play out in small ways, but they are no different here. The murder of Mr. Pritchard was not about theft or passion. It was about a lie, one tied to the Anglo-Saxon brooch." She paused, her eyes sweeping the room, noting the tension in each suspect's face. "The brooch, as we now know, is a forgery, a clever one, but modern, not the 8th century heirloom it was claimed to be. Mr. Pritchard's notes, with their question mark beside a sketch of the brooch, showed he suspected this truth. His death, I believe, was to silence that suspicion, to protect a reputation or a legacy from ruin." Crest's face flushed, and he leaned forward, his voice sharp. "This is outrageous. That brooch was my wife's heirloom, verified by Dr. Ward. If it's a forgery, Pritchard must have tampered with it." His indignation was fierce, but Miss Marple caught the flicker of unease in his eyes, quickly masked. Dr. Ward's hands trembled as she adjusted her glasses. "I reviewed the documentation thoroughly," she said, her voice thin. "I had no reason to doubt its authenticity. Ernest's skepticism was misguided." Her words faltered, and Miss Marple noted the fear in her posture, like a bird poised to flee. Miss Marple continued, her tone calm but unyielding. "The scarf, with its peacock feathers, was the key to this puzzle. Mrs. Tuttle, the cleaner, confirmed it belonged to Dr. Ward, seen wearing it in the archive the day before the murder. Dr. Ward claims it was lost, perhaps stolen, but I believe it was no accident. In St. Mary Mead, I once knew a woman, Mrs. Price, who left a ribbon at a scene of deceit, claiming it was misplaced. Such items are rarely lost by chance. They are left with purpose or in panic." She turned to Dr. Ward, her eyes gentle but piercing. "Dr. Ward, your reputation as a historian is built on your meticulous scholarship. The brooch was to be the crown of your work, a discovery that would secure funding and acclaim. But when Mr. Pritchard began to question its authenticity, it threatened everything. You forged the brooch, didn't you? Or at least knew of its falsity. And when Pritchard's tests grew too close, you acted to protect your career. Dr. Ward's face crumpled, her glasses slipping as she shook her head. No, that's not true. I didn't forge anything. The documentation was convincing. I believed it. Her voice broke, and she buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. Miss Marple's voice softened, but her words were relentless. You met Mr. Pritchard in the archive that morning, before Miss Drake's scream. Mrs. Tuttle saw you there, though you denied it. You confronted him about his doubts, perhaps hoping to dissuade him. But when he insisted on further tests, you panicked. The scarf, your own, was at hand. A silent weapon, strong enough to do the deed. You strangled him, scattered the papers to suggest a struggle, and left the scarf on the hook, hoping it would be seen as a stranger's act. Miss Drake gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Doctor. Ward, no, you couldn't have. Her voice was a mix of shock and loyalty, but Miss Marple noted the ink stains on her fingers, a reminder of her own curious presence in the archive. Gibbs shifted uncomfortably, his gruff voice breaking the silence. I was upstairs, like I said. That dust on my boot. I must have stepped in the archive after, when I heard the scream. I didn't see nothing. His defensiveness was clear, but Miss Marple believed him. The dust suggested he arrived too late to be the killer. Crest's fingers stopped drumming, his face pale. If the brooch is a forgery, I was deceived as well. I trusted Dr. Ward's expertise. His tone was measured, but Miss Marple saw the calculation in his eyes, as if he were distancing himself from the scandal. Dr. Ward's head snapped up, her eyes wild with fear. I didn't mean to do it, she cried, her voice breaking the room's tension like a snapped thread. I forged the brooch to secure a grant. My funding was at risk, my career. Ernest was going to expose me, ruin everything. I went to the archive to reason with him, but he wouldn't listen. I grabbed the scarf. It was instinctive. I didn't plan it. Her sobs filled the room, and she collapsed back into her chair, her glasses falling to the table. Craddock stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. Doctor, Evelyn Ward, you're under arrest for the murder of Ernest Pritchard. As a constable moved to restrain her, Miss Marple sat back, her expression somber but satisfied. The pattern was complete, the threads of the scarf, the forged brooch, and Pritchard's fatal doubts woven into a clear picture. Mrs. Bantry turned to Miss Marple, her eyes wide. Jane, you've done it again. How did you know? Miss Marple's smile was gentle, her needles resuming their quiet rhythm. It's the small things, Clara. The scarf, the nervous gesture, the lie told too quickly. In St. Mary Mead, I've seen human nature laid bare, and it's no different here. The past, when tampered with, can be a dangerous thing. As Dr. Ward was led away, her sobs echoing in the hall, Miss Marple looked out at the museum, its relics silent but eloquent. The truth had been found, stitched together from the smallest threads, and the museum could rest once more.